This video will cover the divisions of the nervous system and neural pathways part of the Unit 3 course for Higher Human. There's going to be two videos for this part, one on the divisions and then one on the neural pathways. So this first part on divisions of the nervous system will cover a lot of the stuff that you covered in National 5, or at least some of the key details. And then we'll jump back to part of Unit 2 when we talked about the autonomic nervous system and the control of the heart rate. So you'll need to know generally the functions of the nervous system. Now, even though you've maybe not necessarily been taught this as clearly or as directly, the functions of the nervous system you might already kind of know. So if you think about it, your nervous system takes in information, and that information is sensory. So your sense organs will be the ones that will take in this information. So things like your eyes, your ears, your skin, and it'll also take in information from internal structures, things that will tell you about your temperature or body, like water levels and things like that. So it will detect information from a whole range of sources. So your body then has to decide what to do with that. So therefore it analyses it and it will process it. Now when it does that, it will store some of that information. That may be in the form of memories. So for example, if I want to remember this and I'm processing this incoming sensory information from my eyes on the video and my ears from the sound, I'll then process that in my brain and store it, hopefully. If you don't store it, or you can store it and then you can decide whether you want to act on it or not, like physically act on it. So therefore, you can then act on some of that information too. Now, some of that information might not even be processed properly, or it might just be lost due to a whole range of reasons. And then finally, once you decide to act on it, it'll make motor responses. So your motor responses, if you think back to National 5 in this part of the control and communication topic for that, it's effectors that are carrying out this. Okay, so effectors in a neural pathway will be the ones that carry out a response. And effectors will be things like glands, which will produce glandular secretions. So that could be sweat, or it could be hormones, it could be enzymes, things like that. Or they could be muscles, and therefore that muscle would contract and then move away from a stimulus or move towards a stimulus or something like that. So the typical example uses things like McDonald's. Right, your sense organs will detect that you're near McDonald's, you'll smell it, you'll see it. Your brain will process it and decide that you want to go and get a McDonald's. So your motor response would be that it would then send impulses to your effectors, particularly to your muscles, to make you walk towards McDonald's, and also to your glands, which will make your salivary glands produce saliva and make you drool and really want that McDonald's. Okay, now this could be a whole range of reasons why you use this. It can be to do with regulating body temperature, or it can be to do with just something as straightforward seemingly as McDonald's. Okay, so one key thing to remember as well, which is a National 5 point, which still links to higher, is that all that information is passed in the form of electrical impulses. And those electrical impulses are passed along neurons. So neurons are just a fancy term for nerve cells. Now, before I go into the details of the divisions of it, I'm going to then quickly give you an overview of the divisions. So your nervous system has two main divisions, first of all. Now, one of those divisions you'll know from National 5, which is called your central nervous system. Now, that central nervous system can be shortened to the CNS. Now, you'll know from National 5 the divisions of the nervous system. You'll know that you have a brain and you have a spinal cord, and these two are the ones that you still need to know for higher. So your first main division you need to know would be your central nervous system with your brain and your spinal cord. So far, still so National 5. Now, out with your brain and your spinal cord, your body is full of nerves, massive amounts of nerves in almost every part of your body. So the ones out with your central nervous system, out with the main core of your body, or your body nervous system that's central, would be then your peripheral nervous system. and that can be shortened to the PNS. Now, within your peripheral nervous system, you have a couple of divisions. Okay, so within that peripheral nervous system, so all the nerves out with your central nervous system, you have your somatic nervous system. I'm just going to shorten nervous system to NS here. And then you have what's called your autonomic nervous system. Right, so again, we've talked about the autonomic nervous system, we talked about it in Unit 2. So hopefully you'll remember then that the autonomic nervous system has 2 further divisions. And those divisions are your sympathetic. So you've got sympathetic nerves, so sympathetic nervous system, and your parasympathetic. So if you remember from Unit 2, from the cardiac conducting system and the nervous control, that sympathetic nervous system will increase heart rate by then producing noradrenaline, and the parasympathetic nerves will produce acetylcholine, and that will drop the heart rate and drop that impulse coming from the SAN. So this links to Unit 2, so these questions that could relate, they could link Unit 2 and Unit 3 together. Okay, so this is your overview for the whole of the nervous system. So what I'm going to do is talk about each of these branches in the next couple of minutes. So if we initially talk about the nervous system, just as an overall, we have 2 branches. We have the CNS, which is the one I talked about, the central nervous system, and we have the PNS, which is your peripheral nervous system. So your central nervous system is made up of a couple of parts. So these parts are your brain, which is hopefully one that you'll recognise here, and then your spinal cord here. And these together form your CNS, your central nervous system. Now all the nerves that are out with that brain and that spinal cord, these ones that I've shown that would run down the arms and the legs, or around your face or in your hands or whatever else, these make up your PNS, your peripheral nervous system. Okay, and they run around the rest of the body. Okay, and the PNS is any neurons that are out with the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, so if I jump back to this divisions, we've covered this central nervous system part, and we're then going to dive into the peripheral nervous system now. Okay, so as we talked about, the peripheral nervous system has 2 divisions. It is the somatic and it is the autonomic. So your somatic nervous system is very much similar to what we talked about in National 5, similar to what we talked about before. We talked about reflex actions and reflex arcs. So it works in a similar way, except we don't talk about the interneuron anymore, we just talk about them as being neural pathways. Okay, so when we talk about the somatic nervous system, we're talking about the neurons in your peripheral nervous system. So those ones are sensory neurons and they're motor neurons. Now hopefully you remember this from National 5, that sensory neurons take information from a sense organ to the central nervous system or to the spinal cord, depending on where or what type of reaction it requires. And motor neurons will take information from the brain or the spinal cord down to an effector. So in this diagram, you're going to have to label a few things, or going to have to be able to label a few things. But I'm going to add just a wee point about the sensory neurons first. That takes information to the CNS. And then motor neurons take it from the CNS. Now when I say information, I'm referring to electrical impulses. Okay, so information in the form of electrical impulses. So if we think about a typical neural pathway, right, how we would then get information in, process it, and then act on it. You would have initially a sense organ normally, or some information input. So this sense organ, this eye for example, would have receptors in it. Now that can be in the retina, it could be on the eyelid, it could be anywhere depending on what kind of information we're looking to process. So there are sensory receptors in that sense organ. Now what those sensory receptors do is they detect a stimulus. Okay, and that could be, for example, the visual stimulus that you're seeing right now in this video. Okay, now those sensory receptors detect that stimulus, detect that information, and they'll pass it along a neuron. Now the neuron they pass it along is going from a sensory organ to the central nervous system. Okay, and that neuron there would be your sensory neuron then. Okay, because it's picking up information from the sense organs by sensory receptors, and it's taking it to the central nervous system, taking it to the brain or to the spinal cord, depending. Okay, so your brain will process that and it'll analyse it and it'll decide what to do with it. And if it decides to make a motor response, so it decides to make an action, either a glandular action or a muscular action, it will send an impulse down your spinal cord to your muscles. And it'll do that by sending an electrical impulse along a motor neuron. Now that motor neuron will send an impulse to either a muscle or a gland. In this example, it's a muscle. So this would be an effector. Okay, so for example, this effector might be the muscle in the arm. And what that'll do is, if you think of this YouTube video as an example, your eyes are taking in information, sensory information, that stimulus, and it's sending that message to the brain, and the brain processes it and it thinks, well, I may want to write down a note on this. So it sends an impulse down to the motor neuron and the muscles in my arm and in my hand, and it tells my hand to write down a note on it. Okay, so it brings about a response. And that response would be, in this example, a contraction. Okay, to write down whatever note I would like to write down. If this example was, say for example, my eye seeing a donut, it would send information up to my brain in the sensory neuron. My brain would process it and think, I want to pick up that donut. So it would then send an impulse down a motor neuron to that muscle. That muscle would contract and then lead my arm towards picking up the donut. Or it could send an impulse along a motor neuron to the glands in my mouth, in the salivary glands, and tell them to produce saliva, preparing my mouth for that donut. Okay, so far these are very similar to what we talked about in National 5. Okay, it's just that now we refer to this as a somatic nervous system, okay, which is a division of the peripheral nervous system. Now the last division that we have of the peripheral nervous system, because there are two, is your autonomic nervous system. Okay, so just to jump back to the divisions, we've covered central nervous system, brain and spinal cord. We've covered the peripheral nervous system and the somatic side of it. And now we're going to talk about the autonomic side of it, okay, which involves the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So your autonomic nervous system we've talked about in Unit 2 already. So your autonomic nervous system is involved in regulating internal structures. So parts of your body that are kind of essential, so your digestion, your heart, your lungs, all that kind of stuff. Okay, so it regulates those internal structures. It can also regulate things that wouldn't necessarily be classed as organs generally, so things like your blood vessels too. Okay, and it carries out automatic actions. So your heartbeat is an automatic action. Your breathing is automatic. Now yes, you can make it conscious by thinking about it, but generally it's automatic. Your digestion is automatic and involuntary. You don't really control it consciously. Okay, so all these are about structures within you that you don't really think about to control. Right? And they allow homeostatic control. Now that term just basically means balance. So if you think about your body temperature, it sticks around about 37 degrees. You would achieve homeostasis by keeping that balanced at 37 degrees, or the same with your body water regulation. Okay, so you're just trying to keep everything in balance. So your autonomic nervous system does that by having two branches, and it works through antagonistic action. Now, antagonistic action basically just means opposing action. So they carry out opposing actions. Right, now the previous example in Unit 2 that I gave you was, if you think about your arm, the bicep lifts your arm and the triceps lowers your arm, okay, and it straightens it. They're doing opposite things, right? So they're antagonistic towards each other. So that antagonistic action is carried out by two divisions of the autonomic nervous system. It's carried out by the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic. And they both affect things like heart rate, breathing rate, your digestive system, blood pressure, all sorts of other things. But they'll do it in opposing actions. So your sympathetic nervous system is referred to as the one that will be involved in fight or flight. So if you think about it, if you get a scare, think about what happens to your heart rate. Your heart rate will increase, right, due to the effect of the sympathetic nervous system. When your heart rate increases, you're looking to pump more blood around your body because you want to get more oxygenated blood around your body to be able to run away or fight. So your breathing rate also increases. Now at this point in time, you don't want your body to be spending a whole bunch of energy producing intestinal secretions to digest stuff. You don't want blood towards your intestines, so you decrease the intestinal secretions and you really reduce digestion for a bit. Now lastly, peristalsis is that movement of squeezing stuff through your digestive system. You don't want that to be continuing at that point in time. You want to slow that right down. So you slow down peristalsis. Now your parasympathetic nervous system does the opposite from that, and it's referred to as the one that's involved in rest and digest. So when you're at rest right now, for example, your heart rate will be lower and the parasympathetic nervous system will decrease your heart rate. It will also decrease your breathing rate because you don't want your heart rate to be low but your breathing rate to be high. You don't need that. And when you're sitting and you're resting and digesting, your intestinal secretions are increased and your peristalsis, that squeezing of movement through your intestinal channels, would then increase then, so that you move things through and you digest when you're sitting relaxing. Okay, so just to round off, these divisions, central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, straightforward enough, and we've covered that in National 5. Peripheral nervous system is all the nerves out with the central nervous system. And within that, you get two divisions of it. Somatic nervous system, which is involving your sensory and your motor neurons, which I'll just add on to this. So your sensory and motor neurons are involved in your somatic nervous system. Your autonomic nervous system is involved in the two divisions, your sympathetic and parasympathetic. So sympathetic will increase heart rate and breathing rate, for example, and decrease your intestinal stuff. And parasympathetic will decrease your heart rate and your breathing rate, but increase your digestion. Okay, so the next video then we'll cover neural pathways to finish off this part of the topic.